3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
All
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
Why do we vote on the first Tuesday in November? Why not the third Thursday in June? Or on a specific date like March 1st? Well, the answer is that in 1845, Congress decided to designate the first Tuesday in November as Election Day. They chose this time of the year because in the largely agricultural society that America was at the time, it wasn't during planting or harvest seasons. Tuesday was chosen because Election Day often required travel. Voting on Monday would require travel on Sunday, which would interfere with worship. In addition, many businesses did their books on the first Monday of the month. In any case, Election Day has stayed on that day in the calendar ever since, and Americans rightly view voting as a sacred right, and one that is always facing challenges. Here to talk about one of those challenges and the conservative response to it, the SAVE Act, is Heritage Action for America's Executive Vice President, Ryan Walker. Ryan Walker, welcome to Heritage Explains.
Thanks for having me on.
First of all, you're the Executive Vice President for Heritage Action for America. That's slightly different from the Heritage Foundation. Can you explain kind of your organization and how it relates to Heritage?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that we get asked often. So Heritage Action is under the tax code, a C4 tax-exempt organization. And what that means in practice is that we can have a grassroots army of individuals throughout the country who are engaged in the political and lawmaking process at both the state and federal level. And we as an organization can advocate for certain policy positions or solutions that we as conservatives adhere to and would like to see promoted and passed or signed into law across the country. And so we can do those two things, and those two things are not allowed on the C3 side of things or the foundation's work.
So in other words, we at the Heritage Foundation, we're nonpartisan. We can't endorse a particular piece of legislation, a particular legislator or candidate, but Heritage Action can.
That's correct. We can advocate for specific legislation. We can come out and say that an individual candidate supports the right policy solutions and that we believe that that person should be elected into office. So we have a few more tools in the toolbox than the Heritage Foundation does in terms of politics.
And at the moment, you guys are working pretty hard on hitting the ground in a lot of swing states and a lot of the things that's going on with the election. Can you just tell us real quick about some of the things you're most excited about that Heritage Action's doing?
Yes, we are on the ground in both Arizona and Georgia, registering people to vote, to exercise their rights. And we are engaged in training individuals to be poll workers and poll watchers at the state and local level so that they can be a part of our election process, to give them confidence in how our elections are administered these days. Obviously, it's a top of mind priority for us at Heritage Action and our grassroots supporters that election integrity be promoted and advocated for. And so we try to do a lot in that vein to make sure that people have a connection to the process and feel involved.
So one of the big things you guys have been talking about this week, Congress is back. They're back on the Hill. They're back to work. And one of the things they're talking about is funding the government. And one of the things that's on the table is the continuing resolution. Can you talk about what is a continuing resolution and what is Heritage Action saying about this particular proposal?
Yeah, great question. So a continuing resolution, every year Congress has to go through an appropriations process to fund the federal government, to spend taxpayer dollars on the priorities that those members who are elected choose to support. And it's north of $1 trillion. It's a very expensive ordeal, but it's an annual process. There are 12 what are called appropriations bills that are supposed to fund the federal government. But Congress, the budgeting and then appropriations process at the federal level in many ways is fundamentally broken. Congress regularly fails every year to pass all 12 appropriation bills. They have to go through both the House and the Senate. And it ends up either being what we call an omnibus, which is a combination of 12 appropriation bills all cobbled together by leadership, most of the time the Speaker and the Majority Leader in the Senate. A handful of staff, maybe 10 to 15 staff, put this all together, and then members have to take an up or down vote on it. And that's how we think we've arrived at the place that we are at now, where we're spending too much money on programs that the American people largely don't support and don't want to see continued. But every year in September 30th is when the fiscal year runs out. And so Congress has to start appropriating money for the next year. So in this year, 2024, in September, Congress will have to consider how to fund the federal government that goes into 2025. And the question in front of them will be a continuation of Biden funding levels or a new omnibus appropriations bill. And from our perspective at Heritage Action, we believe that the next administration, because this is a presidential election year, that Congress should not dictate the next year's priorities, presumably under a new administration, whether it be Kamala or President Trump, that Congress should not be dictating to the White House and to the agencies how they should be spending their money until we have someone in power who can have an influence and put their own fingerprint on what that product looks like. So, in short, Heritage Action is saying if we are going to do a continuing resolution, which Congress has arrived at that conclusion, because in an election year, most members, not all, but most, don't want to see a government shutdown. The media and the way it's controlled by the left very much put it on the heads of Republicans as being the cause of a government shutdown. And so to get past that point, how do we get past it? It's either a December timeline so that they can, in a lame duck, after a new administration is voted into power, but before they take the oath of office, they do what's called clearing the decks. They consider all these appropriation bills, pass a giant omnibus, restricting the next administration on what they would be allowed to do or not do, importantly. And so our top priority in this whole conversation is getting this to March of 2025. So a continuing resolution, while not ideal, we've never advocated for a continuing resolution. We think that Congress should be doing the work that they themselves signed up to do, annual appropriations. But if you're in a situation where you must do this to avoid the worst possible outcome, it's to get it into March.
So what you're essentially proposing is that when American citizens cast their vote in November, that vote will actually have efficacy on what Congress decides to spend money on next year, as opposed to almost a whole year from now.
That's absolutely right. Let's imagine a scenario where the House does pass a continuing resolution. They keep the government open, but conveniently that deadline falls December 17th. And now all of a sudden, members are under pressure for the Christmas break and wanting to be home with their families. They're under pressure to keep the government open over the Christmas holidays. And they're under pressure to clear the decks for the next administration so that they're hamstrung by a lot of these policies that many people in Congress are on their way out the door, right? Either retiring members or people who have been voted out. Those members should not have an influence over the next fiscal year's appropriations goals or strategy or the finite numbers on all of those levers of agency funding. And so, our insistence is if you're going to do a continuing resolution, which we anticipate Congress needing to do, that you push it out until March so that a presumed Trump administration and a Republican majority in the House and the Senate can have their fingerprints on it. And we can finally get into the process of cutting government spending, which is what we've been clamoring for over a decade.
Another component of this conversation that we've been hearing about is what's called the SAVE Act. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the SAVE Act? Why is it connected to the CR?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the SAVE Act, in short, would require states to require proof of citizenship when an individual registers to vote. It would also require that states go into their voter rolls and clean their voter rolls of any individual that they have identified as being illegally present in the United States. It is a violation of law as an illegal immigrant to vote in federal elections. However, states are still allowing for illegal immigrants to register to vote. It may be a crime to actually take up the practice of voting, but it does nothing to prevent them from registering and having the ability to utilize that action. And so what we're saying is that Congress needs to dictate to states. We've seen states, Texas in particular, Virginia in particular, Georgia, have all come out recently and said, we've actually identified illegal immigrants that have been registered to vote in our states. Texas alone removed over 1 million people from their voter rolls recently who were illegal immigrants who had registered to vote. Democrats have said this is not a problem. There's nothing to see here. It's already illegal to vote if you are an illegal immigrant. But we've seen the reality that there are folks who are registered who are illegal. So this bill would require states to go in and undo this, right? And to protect our federal elections more than they already are, to require states to ask for proof of citizenship as you're registering to vote. We think it's a very reasonable ask. It goes along with the idea that you shouldn't be able to vote if you are an illegal, right? We don't put up a speed limit sign on the highway and then say we don't need to hire cops because we put up the speed sign. Well, the same can be said about making it illegal to vote. Sure, it's illegal to vote, but we also need to have the enforcement mechanisms to make sure that people don't have the ability to do it. And so we're asking and urging Congress to include the SAVE Act. And I think it's important this year, over the past 4 years, we've seen over 10 million illegal immigrants come into the country under this administration. And so we think it's vital that we advocate for this and that Congress includes it, so that we protect our elections going into November, and that we create the narrative in this country that we are going to protect the sanctity of American federal elections by requiring proof of citizenship. It's a 90-10 issue for Americans across the spectrum, political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, from here to California. A 90-10 issue that we think that Congress should take up.
What's the justification for allowing an illegal immigrant to register to vote if you have no intention of them voting?
Well, the Democrats would say that it's already illegal and that there's nothing to see here. You don't need to have the steps prior to the action of actually voting. That you don't need it because it's already illegal. And if they do that, we'll have a Department of Justice or a law enforcement agency go after and enforce those rules. Well, as we've learned, it is oftentimes very difficult to figure out after the fact who those illegal immigrants are that actually voted. And so the enforcement mechanism, holding them accountable for violating the law, voting illegally, is a very difficult practice. And if you can stop it at the very beginning of the process, if you can nip it in the bud by saying, no, you just have to show your paperwork, we think that it can go a long way towards solving that problem.
But that seems silly. So, I mean, it would seem that there's no real utility to having anybody register to vote who actually isn't eligible to vote. So what could be the potential idea behind this practice in the first place? Well,
I think so. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi was giving an interview over the weekend, may have been at the end of last week, over the weekend, where she said the quiet part out loud, that they want to make all of these folks, they want to transition them from illegal status to legal status. And immediately, if they are already registered to vote, those people become eligible to vote. And that would be 10 million people, more than 10 million people, that Democrats believe would constitute almost a permanent political majority in this country, allowing them to do a whole host of things, which starts with the filibuster in the Senate, allowing for Puerto Rico and D.C. statehood, and basically any legislative ask that Democrats have, they would be able to get it through. So that ultimately is their aim.
Some on the political left have said that the SAVE Act isn't really viable. Speak to that.
Yeah, I think that you've had Senator Schumer, you've had President Biden come out in opposition to the bill. Again, using a lot of the talking points that we've discussed here, that there's not a problem with illegals voting. We have not seen that. The Department of Justice has not pursued any of those claims. I would say that they're not looking for them, but they use those excuses as reasons for not doing it, and so they're rejecting it out of hand. And so I think it's important that we have this debate, that Congress include it and try to fight for this position. But know that this is not the last opportunity that Republicans will have to put forward the SAVE Act. And despite Democrats putting up barriers for us getting this done, despite it being a 90-10 issue for American voters, we will have more instances and ability to get this through, especially with the potential for a Trump administration in 2025.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the timing of all of this. Of course, that's a critical component with changing administrations, with the legislative schedule. Why is the timing so important?
Yeah, and I think this is something I really want to harp on for our listeners here today. The main and most onerous thing that we need to be concerned with, in our opinion, is the potential for an omnibus in Christmas during the Christmas season in a lame duck. One, they could increase government spending across the board for all agencies. They could juice Democrat spending initiatives and priorities, and there would be some Republicans that would go along with that. And so you would see all the agencies that have been acting in direct opposition to the American people continue that for some time. You would see reauthorizations of programs like the Farm Bill and other programs that are going to lapse in the interim. You would see all of those get tacked on, and the American people have very little, if any, say in all of that. And again, this is an up or down vote for members in December, right before they need to get home to be with their families for Christmas. And so if we can avoid a Christmas lame duck omnibus lawmaking exercise, I think that we all win out, and the American people will win out. We will save money. Government spending will be cut. We will have the opportunity in March with a potential Trump administration to go after the SAVE Act yet again. And I think that there's a high likelihood in a Trump administration that the SAVE Act is signed into law in the first 6 months of the administration. And so if we can get to March, I think that we have a fighting chance for all of our priorities, not just government spending and going after a weaponized Department of Justice or a weaponized Health and Human Services agency. The list is endless, but we also have the opportunity to go after and pass the SAVE Act and go after this illegal immigrant problem yet again, and legislate on some of these most important issues like the border wall and funding for ICE and the CBP at our southern border. We'll have the opportunity to have those battles in March. And if we can get there, I think that we will create wins for the American people. And so I encourage all of us, tune in to Heritage Action and all the content that we're putting out, and encouraging folks to weigh in with members of Congress on both the SAVE Act and the timeline for the CR as it comes up here in September.
Ryan Walker, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Ryan Walker for his contribution to this episode. You can follow Ryan on X at Ryan L. Walker. If you want to learn more about the work of Heritage Action for America, you can find them on your favorite social media platform or at their website, heritageaction.com. And of course, thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with your thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.